Hello, everyone. Coming to you from Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm Scott Harrison, Artistic Director of Ironweed Productions, and I want to welcome you to Talking Theater Santa Fe, a series of conversations between me and Santa Fe theater artists, sharing stories about their experiences in the theater and the unique paths that led them to creating theater in Santa Fe. I'm very honored to have as my guest this evening Santa Fe artist, poet, organizer, and most recent Santa Fe Youth Poet Laureate, Artemisio Romero Carver. Artemisio, thanks so much for joining me tonight.
I'm really glad I could be here. Thank you.
A little bit more about Artemisio before we get started. Artemisio Romero Carver is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He is a co-founder, steering committee member, and policy director of Youth United for Climate Crisis Action, Yucca, a youth-led nonprofit that advances climate justice, democracy, and civil rights. Artemisio's art pursues those same goals. His visual art has been shown at the Zalma Lofton Gallery, the Zane Bennett Gallery, the Napa Valley Museum, and Warehouse 508, among others. His writing has appeared in publications that include Genre, Urban Arts, Inlandia Literary Journal, Tumbleweed Magazine, and Magma Poetry. Artemisio received the 30 Under 30 Changemakers Award from the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools, earned first place in specialty articles during the New Mexico Press Women 2020 Communication Contest, and was Santa Fe's 2020 Youth Poet Laureate. He is also a recent graduate of the New Mexico School for the Arts. And Artemisio, congratulations on your recent graduation.
Thanks. No, I'm still processing it, but
Yeah,
yeah.
cool. I always like to start off the interviews at the beginning. And I just wanted to see for you, what's your first memory of being kind of captured by words or language?
Yeah. Well, okay. I was always introduced to art, like from a young age, right? My father was an art critic when I was growing up. And so, I was really privileged in that way. And I remember even like wanting to leave art galleries when I was young and just being like, oh God, no, not another opening. Yeah, now I realize I was like turning down some wonderful experiences. But I like the visual stuff was all around me. The moment that like I start to think about words in the same way, or that they start to even be maybe the more primary thing that I'm starting to just like worship's the wrong word, but just like really love as a kid.
Mm.
Um, I remember it started with hip hop music. It started with Killer Mike and Immortal Technique would probably be the two first artists that I got really into. And it happened during like a really bad time in my life, um, during which, I was kind of barricaded in a room, just going through a lot of stuff family wise and in terms of like domestic abuse and safety, not to get into too much, and absolutely feeling like a sense of real victimization and disempowerment. And then I started listening to this music that was very angry, um, and articulate. And there was something really useful to me in the fact that like you take an Immortal Technique song, and so much of that is like, it's political rap, it's conscious rap, and it's music that identifies like, hey, like I'm being marginalized, I'm being harmed, I am being victimized structurally or interpersonally, um, and my survival of that is a point of pride. And that, I'm paraphrasing and I'm summarizing what is a very complicated like series of work.
Yeah.
Also, I just want to clarify, a lot of that stuff is incredibly homophobic, and like people who would not like, the kind of person I am was the kind of music I grew up on, but it was still like music that is valuable to me,
Mhm.
um in like a complex way. But that idea that the survival of the victimization was a point of pride, that survival was a point of pride, became something that I started to like build my sense of self around and preserve my sense of self with. And it just so happened that the way that I got that was in words. And
Mhm.
since then, I like really just liked the words, and
Yeah.
I kept that. Yeah. I just have like an insane love of puns.
Oh,
Um,
yeah?
it tests almost all of my loved ones to various extents, but I have no idea what to blame that on. That's just, there's like a gene for it, I assume.
Interesting. Wow. So when you when you kind of first started writing, I mean, what was poetry kind of what you were drawn to in terms of writing, or did you initially kind of I mean, did you used to write kind of in a journal, or you know what I mean, or was it really poetry that you were initially drawn to?
I didn't think that I would ever like. I didn't think I was going to be a poet. I didn't see that one coming. I mean, also like I say I'm a poet. I say I'm a poet because no one stopped me from saying it so far. So I'm gonna just keep doing it, right? But like I didn't think that I'd like get to a point where that would be a thing that I consistently did, or like as a means of identity. And I didn't conceptualize the stuff I was making as poetry. So when I was a little kid, I listened to this music. I started to fall in love with writing. I remember I wrote all these little like YA books based on all the YA books I was reading as a kid. I also loved reading. It was like the perfect form of escapism.
Uh,
Um, but when I realized I was heading to high school, I kind of put the writing stuff away for a second
mm,
because I was like, I don't want to go to Santa Fe High. I had just gone through some really intense stuff. I had, um, at that moment, I think basically that summer, I want to say before I went to high school, maybe a year before, um, like separated from my mother. Like she'd been taken out of my life. The courts had gotten involved for the sake of my safety. She'd been taken out of my life. And I was definitely in a weird place, and like a risky place for a kid to be in. And I was like, I'm not gonna do well at Santa Fe High. Everything that I had heard was like, you go to Santa Fe High, you get what you put in. And I didn't think I was gonna be someone who was gonna do like 6 APs successfully in the emotional state that I was in. So I was like, okay, I can't do Santa Fe High. I know that that's not gonna work out for me. I know it's not set up for me to succeed there. There's this other little charter school called the New Mexico School for the Arts, and it's audition based. And I had never really like I drew a lot when I was a little kid, but I wasn't, I again in the same way I wasn't a poet, I wasn't an artist. But I was like, I got a summer, or I got some time. Let's figure out how to be an artist and let me get myself into this arts charter school, just like for the sake of self-preservation at that point, emotionally, physically. And I spent like, I went to my dad, and my dad was he's a fine artist. I don't mean that as a like he does fine art. He's a great artist, not a fine artist, but
oh yeah.
he's a fine artist, and he was a art critic for a long time. And I was like, hey, can you teach me how to draw? And so he did. And I just like did it religiously, and I did all of this portraiture work and just got very into precise, primarily pencil, like figure drawing.
Mm.
And that got me into high school, and that got me into a kind of high school where I could, not take 7 APs and be okay. And I, so that happened, and I got to high school, and in being in high school, I was producing artwork, and I wasn't fully in love with the idea of being an artist, but I was like, this is the thing I can do. People seem to give me opportunities for this thing. I should just keep doing it, right? At the same time, through all of that time, I'd been freestyling with friends. Um, and I had been writing things in journals. And, in the same way that like if a kid really likes Tony Hawk, you try to imitate how he skates, or you try to learn how to skate, right? I
Mm.
really like idolized these rappers. Right. I went on initially from Immortal Technique and Killer Mike to more technical dudes like Aesop Rock, or I think at that point I was also really into Jean Grey. But so a range of stuff,
Mm.
and I'd freestyle with friends to imitate that, and I write little edits of their work, almost like master copies, but of like a song off an album, and I'd make all of that, and I was like, okay, this is imitation stuff, this isn't really like, I'm an artist, I'm not a writer. And then I decided that I wanted to potentially graduate early, so I took this class for poetry because I was like, poetry class is an easy A, right? I can put words down, and if it's anything like art, you can largely bullshit it. And I mean that respectfully. I just mean that it's like hard to call a bluff in an art
Yeah,
setting, same
yeah,
way like in a STEM setting, it probably isn't.
yeah.
Um, so I got into that space, and I had these little books, and I ended up showing them to a teacher, Georgia Van Guten, and she kind of introduced me to this idea that like these things that are to me these like little funny word things I get to put in my journals could in a different context be called poetry, and that's a thing that they could be, and that's like a career that certain people have, and that's a whole like lifestyle and identity and practice. um I say that though, just the idea that they're poetry, that obviously wasn't what like catapulted me into like really producing a lot of poetry.
Mm.
Because soon after I wrote like on the third manuscript. um and what really happened is I had these little words. I shared them with the teacher. The teacher recommended me to the writing department head. Um, and she invited me to do a little spoken word thing at this school, like open house. And it was the first time I'd ever performed in front of anyone, right? It was the first time I performed point blank. It wasn't just poetry,
Wow.
performance at all, because I
No,
was doing paintings, right?
what was
Um,
that? So yeah, I'd be interested in what that was like, what that experience was like, just the act of performing for the first time.
yeah, so I was a sophomore at that point, and I was very nervous. And the poem that I had written was like a long poem, which is the worst kind of poem to perform. It was like 4 or 5 minutes, and almost entirely about the domestic abuse I had experienced as a child. Um, which is like also heavy to bring it to like a open house meet and greet. Um, and also absolutely, you put that kind of content in something, you run the risk of like it kind of bending into pretension. I went up there, and I remember specifically that the computer I was reading off of was the writing department's head's computer, and it was so heavy. And I wanted to do hand gestures and I wanted to hold it, but I was basically like teetering the entire time. Um, but I did it, and I spoke and I performed for the first time in my life. And the performance itself was good. I liked that feeling a lot. And I really liked being able to interact with the audience. Um, but the best part was the moment after, where like I had this trauma and these memories and these things that, what PTSD does, right, as it relates to trauma, is it traps you in a loop, physically, right, in a constant moment of adrenaline. And it almost traps you in an image and in a scene and a memory. And being able to take that image and that scene and that memory and make it into a story and project it out for other people, to kind of take, voluntarily, it left me feeling a lot better. It was like, because I think one of the main things that trauma leaves you with is the feeling of being unheard, or the experience of being unheard, right? Is disempowerment. And by being able to articulate that story,
Mhm.
um, I could feel really empowered. I think I did a thing that a lot that isn't exclusive to me at all, but it's not something a lot of folks I know do with trauma. But for me, it became really important to own my narrative as soon as possible. Um, like I knew that if I was going to talk to you about my life, it was going to include some dark stuff. And I didn't want to try to hide that, because after, the lesson that I was taught in all those songs when I was a kid, that wasn't a point to be ashamed of. And I wanted to own that publicly, and use that story for something. Yeah. So that was the first like
Yeah,
performance experience.
yeah,
And it got me hooked.
that's really powerful. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. I know. It's funny because I was thinking back to like I stumbled on theater when I was in college. I needed to take a fine arts class in fine arts, and I literally stumbled. I was like, well, I played in the band, so I was like, well, like music's kind of something I'm already doing. I heard that the art teacher that we had at our school was really boring, so I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll take theater. And I ended up, I had this amazing intro teacher that just kind of got me hooked on theater. But I remember for me, like when I just when I found kind of acting for the first time, for me, kind of the most powerful thing was I felt like it was like a lot of my anger that I had never kind of expressed, like had a voice,
Mm.
and like I felt like what drew me to it initially was I'd never felt up to that point like I was expressing my full self of like this is who I am as a full person, and that somehow theater gave me that opportunity. It's just really interesting to hear you talk about your poetry and what that, especially what that feeling was like after you performed, and how, yeah,
No, I hear you.
yeah,
No, I actually very like that first poem is about domestic abuse. It was an angry poem, right? And I'm typically not an angry person. And also, like growing up around volatile personalities, I learned that you don't express your anger outward.
mm,
Um, that was like an early childhood lesson. I still have a really hard time feeling and expressing anger in a format that's not poetry, but it's a different thing, right? It's a different
mhm,
state. And so, like a lot of those emotional limitations that you can put on yourself um don't hold in the
Yeah.
same, the rules aren't the same. And it,
Right.
yeah. So just I had a very similar experience in that, like, that anger for the first time could be experienced in a way that was constructive
Yeah.
and also felt possible.
Right. That's yeah. Yeah. I had that same feeling. Wow. When you when you write, I mean, poetry, is there a, or maybe it's different for everyone that you write, but do you, I know I talk to some writers and they say, well, they just initially they write, they kind of get it all down and then they distill, 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 distill.
Mm.
Or some writers are like, you know what, it just comes out in the form that it comes out. Is there a typical kind of process for you or?
I don't know. I mean, I think we talked about this a little bit before. Um, for me, it's terrible. I mean, I wish there was a set system. It, like, I wish with paintings I can start to get to a formula of like this is what works. With writing, it like either hits or it doesn't. And I've like spent weeks like forcing myself to write things and been like, none of this is good. This is all in fact terrible, and it all sounds the same. And then like I've gotten really tired one afternoon and been like, oh, like that word sounds cool with that word, and made like a whole thing. And that's the best thing that I made that year or that month. Um,
Mhm,
I don't know. I think honestly, most of it has to do with improvisation.
mhm.
Um, and like being in a space. That's why I miss like audiences so much.
Yeah.
Um, I used to like a lot of my favorite poems. I used to like write while I was waiting to do a reading when other people were reading before me. Because you can like, there's like adrenaline that you get, and that adrenaline for me is like really helpful in the writing process. Um, no, it's I have no idea.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I think like
Yeah.
when I mean, really, what I do, I'd like to say that like I can make myself right. That's not true. That like assumes way more power than I actually have in the situation. I occasionally like I make a lot of stuff. Most of it's a few of them are really good. And honestly, once like the good thing happens, I don't edit it that much because I'm like, I don't know exactly why it's working and I don't want to make it not work. And usually like I don't know. It if I can get it down and I can get it recorded, like, and it's something where I genuinely feel like the inspiration. I have to do it all in one like thing. Like I have to write it all down. If I drop it for a second, it's over. But if I can do all of that, I write it out. Um, maybe it's hubris, but like I don't end up editing very much.
That's cool. Well, I know you talked about, because I know we talked about uh, when you talked about your visual art, that you really kind of like that idea of that you can't, you what you put down, you've got to work with. You know, like what you put down on
Yeah,
the canvas, you
yeah.
can't change, you've got to work with. And I mean, I really like that idea too. I mean, that's why I think I'm really drawn to live theater is that thing that what you see that night, that's what it is. You know, and if something goes awry on stage, um,
That's
that's what people are experiencing. And it's like to me, I don't know, I really resonate with that idea of, you know, this is what it is in this moment right now. And
no,
when you talked before about your, you know, how you like to do where, you know, where it's like you put it on the canvas and you've got to work with it. I really like that idea of creativity, you know.
no,
Um,
me too. Because otherwise the stuff I make is kind of dead. Like, um, I really love, like, my favorite kind of art is art that is like, you can go in museums sometimes and you can see the pieces that were like studies for a final painting, like, for
uh,
the grades, right?
yeah,
And I love those a lot more than I like the paintings. When you can like see the way that they've like built the skeletal structure with like linear, with like pencil and linear structure, right? And then they've started to put color on, and then they've got tone, and it's starting to actually appear like flesh, and it's got 3 dimensions, right, on the shoulder, and then this face is still like mostly etched out in pencil. Um, I really love those for some reason. I don't know. It's
yeah,
also like the reason that like live theater or like because you can see them building the thing right in front of you. And because there are the noticeable imperfections that happen when you try to build something like entirely improvisationally, or partially improvisationally, you can trace that and you can see how it gets there.
yeah,
And it's really satisfying for me. I mean, the other reason I don't edit things is because most of the stuff I make rhymes, And I say it all out loud before I write it down. So like really the poems are like documentations of a thing that like of like a free verse thing, and everything rhymes. And so and I really love rhyme schemes in like a nerdy way. And if I take out, this phrase because I don't think it sounds good, the whole rhyme scheme collapses. So it better just like be both rhyming and like poetically useful and valuable.
Yeah.
Um, because if I try to like make it more, poetic or articulate, then it comes at the cost of the rhymes afterwards. Or
Yeah.
if I try to give it more rhymes afterwards, then it comes at the cost of the articulation. Um, yeah, but that's the other thing too, when you build those things like off adrenaline and an audience, or even just like off the adrenaline of like I get one chance to do this,
Yeah.
with an ink painting or in my head, the stakes are so high that I don't know, like you can't consider not doing it right. And so personally, I find that then I start to do it a little bit better, because otherwise I just get lazy.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah, I love that about it too. I mean, with kind of performance of any kind, I feel like those moments when there's, well, quote unquote mistakes, which I don't really feel like they're mistakes. They're just
Yeah,
that's like when you're, I mean, people when you see that they're totally alive on stage. I mean, because they're literally like in the moment, and which I really love. That's really cool. Um, what do you just speaking of kind of the live performance and this period that we've been in with COVID, how do you how do you foresee maybe the live experience kind of changing for people coming out of this time? Do you know what I mean? I've thought a lot about that, like what's going to be most meaningful for people right now in terms of the live experience coming out of this time. I don't know. Are there thoughts you have around that?
that's a good question. I mean, I'm just hoping that we'll get live performances. I miss open mics a lot.
Yeah.
Um, I think that like I don't know. I know that personally, um, I am really excited for it to like be able to be in front of an audience again or to be in an audience again. Honestly, I think I'm a little nervous that we hit that too soon for like safety reasons.
Hmm.
I think that like I know that if you would ask me a year ago if you would ask me 2 years ago if I wanted to go to a concert this weekend, I'd be like, maybe I'm gonna think about it. If you asked me like today, and you could promise that everyone was vaccinated and it's all safe there, do you want to go to a concert? I'd be like, yes, immediately. I'll be in the car. Let's do it right now. Like, I think that I mean, hopefully the demand's there in a bigger way because like absence makes the heart grow fonder. People have been really without like those shared human moments,
Yeah.
which personally for me are like my favorite moments for a long time. And I think as we get the opportunities to do that, I also think too, like there's a lot less, I think people have been forced into a place of like self-reflection and vulnerability in the last year in like a brutal way.
Yeah.
And sometimes like in a really brutal way. Um, but hopefully that also leads to like work that can be additionally vulnerable, right? I know personally like the stakes are a little different. I've already spent like a year with myself, and you know, they're a pretty harsh critic. And I think that like a lot of the stuff that I was doing performatively, right, in terms of like apparel, in terms of like appearance, and all this stuff that can honestly put distance between like you and an audience, I've lost to quarantine because like that upkeep's just impossible. Um, and so I don't know. If I'm gonna get real optimistic, which I don't honestly do very much, but if I want to get real optimistic, my hope is that like we have like a new reason to really love shared human spaces, and also a reason to be like additionally vulnerable in those spaces.
Hmm. That's yeah. I really like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, that's one of my um one of my favorite moments in the theater, whether I'm watching something or whether I'm in something, is that feeling of like it's kind of like what you were describing about the shared humans. It's where, to me, like where there's a silence on stage and you know that everyone in the audience is not necessarily experiencing exactly the same thing, but they're kind of like in the same pool of truth in that moment. I love those, where everyone's just kind of sharing a collective moment. I mean,
Yeah.
to me,
No, I
that's
like
the magic of the live.
because that's like one of the most democratic moments too, right? Like
Right.
even the performer is quiet in that moment. Like
Yeah.
it isn't even like because when the performer's talking or the performers are talking, there's a little bit like of a performer audience relationship. But in that moment, we're all just people who are being quiet in this moment of tension and all experiencing it. And we're all also mutually like assuming that everyone else will be quiet.
Right.
And so everyone's got like power to disrupt that, and very few times do they. Um, yeah, no, those moments are really wonderful.
Yeah. I love the way you describe that too. Yeah, I love that. Um, well, speaking of theater, I remember because you had just or just finished up. We were the filming of the short film that we're producing. I am, which you and seven other young poets from Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and Taos just created these beautiful poems and have performed them in different places around Santa Fe. And you very graciously, aside from performing a poem, were a mentor for several of the poets while they were filming, which was really wonderful. And I just remember while we were on one of the filming, doing one of the filmings, that you and I were talking, and I asked you about, have you done any theater? Have you kind of been drawn to theater? And you mentioned this Arthur Graves character that you created, which then Graves2021.org, this fictitious character who's running for office in 2020. Anyway, I checked out the website and it's awesome. It's satirical. It's pointed. It's funny. And to me, it's a wonderful combination of like satire, great sketch comedy. What was the inspiration for that?
Yeah. So I mean, part of it was like I worked recently as like a lobbyist during the next Mexico 2021 legislative session. And I had so many strange experiences during that session. Like I remember, so I worked for an environmental nonprofit, and we were pushing for environmental legislation. And there was a committee that all of our bills ended up getting sent to, our bills being our priority bills. And there were these Republicans who would like kind of grandstand. And what's the term called? I'm losing it, but basically when you talk for a long time in a committee meeting and ask useless questions as to stall the passage of bills.
Oh, right. Filibuster. Is it the filibuster? Yeah.
Filibustering is like a formal version of it, but yeah, it's essentially
Oh,
it's
but it's the same kind of thing. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And there was one Republican who would make all these really weird like anti-climate change arguments, essentially. But he would start every question, right, or every statement in opposition to these environmental protection bills and sanctions and investments and anyway these environmental bills. And he'd start every single one with he'd go like, well, from a scientific perspective, right? Or like, well, I'm just trying to be scientific about this. And then go on to like, actively invalidate the general scientific consensus, which was really interesting to me. Because like, what does that mean that like from a scientific perspective? That's
Yeah.
a meaningless word. And is like, in my approximation, antithetical to the intended purpose of language. But it's not if you're lying, right? And so it became really interesting to me as I had to do, more and more work experiencing political rhetoric, and then also more and more work looking at political realities and like what happens because of policy, horrible, dangerous things that happen because of policy and the ways that like our policy making literally is killing people. I became just so crazy, the complete gap between the language we're using to describe things
Mhm.
and the things that are happening,
Mhm.
right? The gap between like image and meaning, or between meaning and reality. And you even get like words that don't actually mean anything. Like from a scientific perspective, in that sentence doesn't have like a true meaning.
Mhm.
Um, and so I don't know. This space in between like the form of our politics and the content of our politics became really interesting to me because Arthur Graves is only a little bit more absurd than like several of our presidential candidates, right? He's just like a little bit, just like, a few more strange references, but you just have to stretch that space a little bit farther before it is just entirely nonsense. Um, and so that was interesting to me. The other thing that it came out of was a project I did about a year ago when we could actually talk to people in general.
Mhm.
Now we can again, but like, in quarantine, outside of quarantine, right before quarantine actually hit, I got the chance to do this improv project. It was like what we're talking about. This was like this is when I really was like, I realized I don't even necessarily love audiences. I just love like improvisational stuff.
Uh-huh.
Um, I got to do this thing, and I want to also shout out Amadi Williams and Cal, and they were people who worked with me on this project in California. Um, it was for an assignment at the school we're attending, and I played a similar character named Arthur Clarkson. It's a little bit closer to my name, Artemisio Romero Carver, Arthur Clarkson. And the costume, it wasn't necessarily as kind of like the wig wasn't there. It wasn't as fancy, but I dressed kind of business casual. So I got in my business casual, and I was in Napa, California, and we walked all around Napa. And these two people my age were my interns, right? And I think Amadi was recording. Cal had like things for them to sign, and I would go up to people and I'd talk to them about my run for, I think, state land supervisor, which is of course a made up office and doesn't exist. But actually like went really far. I had a lot of good conversations with people. I got the contact info for a senator I was supposed to reach out to. Like it was hilarious. But also what ended up happening is like the Arthur Clarkson character, and this is the thing, I really hope I can do again because I love the website, but the Arthur Clarkson character eventually became what I could become the more reasonable person in an argument while in this like, hyper American character.
Yeah.
One of the things that hit me, so I'd go around town and I'd ask people what they thought needed to change in Napa. And I get a lot of answers. We always kept coming back to gentrification and rising housing rates. Um, and there was one time for a while, I went to this one thrift store and I asked this older woman who was stocking the shelves, what do you think needs to change in Napa? And she said, there's too many homeless people, um, which, I disagree with. And is like, that's a mixed bag, right? And so, but also understandable maybe if she was arguing that they should be housed.
Mhm.
Unhoused people is the way I prefer to like refer to folks. But so I was like, okay, how far can we stretch this? And so I petitioned to her this policy proposal that I was pushing, in quotations, to send the homeless people to work as indentured servants in the water mines under the town. There's no water mines. You don't mine water in Napa. That's obviously like highly immoral.
Right.
But she was like, I really like that. And I think you've got my vote. And I sold it to like another 2 or 3 people in the shop and then otherwhere. And there was another time that I went into this, me and my team went into this, collaborators, team sounds kind of silly. We went into this little like convenience store and we were doing our thing. We were kids having fun playing this character. And we go and we ask the guy who owns the convenience store and he's not having it. He's just like, you know what's wrong? I know that in a year I won't be able to have my business here. The rates are rising in such a way that I know for sure I will have to close down this business. And this is like an old local business, right? And so that's sad. And that drops, my like fun kid playing a politician thing
Yeah.
out of that's more real than anything I've said in
Right.
like a month at that point.
Yeah.
And I leave. And on the way out, I run into these 2 tourists. And so I asked them the same question. I'm like, what do you think, got to change in Napa? And we go do our little talk and they're both tourists there. And then I tell them, it's interesting. This guy here just told me that he won't be able to maintain this shop. Because the property rates are rising so much because of gentrification. And it's a couple, these tourists. And the guy goes, oh, that's terrible, right? Like, understandably. And the woman goes, eh. And that was one of the like strangest little human interactions I've ever had. And
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I even stopped being a character at that moment, maybe. Anyway, so
Wow. Yeah.
that project was pretty instrumental.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that, yeah, I mean, the fact that you were able to have those experiences within this fictitious character that you created and tap into, um, just got these vastly different experiences. Wow. What did you and so that did that so that kind of inspired the Arthur Graves thing of what kind of wanted to did that kind of inspire the
Oh, totally.
yeah wanted to do
Yeah.
the Arthur Graves and create a website and because you created a .org, right, so that you could that it would be more
I was so glad I got the .org first. I feel like that was I've never been more proud of something in my life that I got like the .org because
yeah
it feels so legitimate, right?
yeah
The Yeah, well, the Arthur Graves thing was like I had made this character and I'd had him interact with like in these improv situations with real people.
yeah
Um, and then I was doing this policy stuff and I was just hearing how insane the rhetoric of like our political establishment sounds in contrast to reality. And I was like, well, Joe Biden's running a campaign from his bedroom. Like Arthur could be too, right? Or from his basement. And at this point, then I had the really hard part of having to turn the character inward and be like, well, this isn't. I'm not just reacting to passerbys on the street. Like
yeah
I've got to actually figure out some values and some positions for this character to have. Um, and I actually, that's the other thing. I'm very flattered to be on this podcast. I am like incredibly underqualified in terms of theater. Like I had to call my friends who are actors and be like, how do you do this? Like, how do you memorize like lines in a way that doesn't sound like a speech? Like, oh my God, please teach me that magic. Because it was hard at first. It still is. But the Arthur Graves thing is really, part of what was interesting to me is like it seemed like he kind of made sense. Like all the performance stuff makes sense when you're with an audience.
uh-huh.
But like, I don't know. How do you be that performative political character and then also go home at night? That was like the question that was interesting to me.
Oh gosh yeah
Because I think like all that work as a symbol must be really lonely. And when I've like done political work and I've just been like, I've simplified myself as to be an effective political tool. It can be lonely because you like become less of a person. Um, yeah, so just all of that stuff and
yeah
Squarespace account is what got me to Arthur Graves.
wow well that I mean well and then it's you I mean it's just interesting because to me like theater is what you do is I mean to me it's all in the same pool it's performing arts it's words it's storytelling it's expression and I think it's fascinating that you created this character and you got like an internal look into this person that you created. I mean, um, just speaking from a strictly theatrical standpoint, because you had a wig, you totally had a different body, like body physicality, really different kind of quality to your voice. Um, just theatrically speaking, in terms of creating a character, was there one part of that process for you that was the most fun, in creating this guy?
Yeah, taking the photos was so hilarious. Like taking the photos was so fun for me. I just like take all these photos and I do you could just do the weirdest things. Like
Yeah.
I have all these photos of me like posing like Vogue style with a basketball based off of like, Reagan's like football
Oh
overall.
yeah.
Um, and that stuff was super fun. Well, and honestly, like giving the speeches was really taxing, but really fun.
Yeah.
You know, I yeah, because like I had been taught and because of like the work that I do, I've learned a lot of those like formal things that you're supposed to do when you give a speech. Um, and then, I'm like, male presenting and my father's white and I'm from like partially, European heritage. And so like getting like, this classic like American voice,
Yeah.
Labrador's college, like going into that voice, it was so
Yeah.
fun.
That's cool.
And to be able to use all those formal tricks that you're supposed to use like statistically to communicate absolutely nothing, or like when it was just nonsense was really fun. It
That's
was like,
cool.
yeah, it
Yeah,
was like
I mean, yeah, it's interesting because to me, like, it's that whole thing too about how, like, when you're creating a character, just sometimes the most subtle external shift, like just in the way you speak, can suddenly just change the whole feeling of who this person is and your kind of your internal life. So for me, it's just always interesting to look at those different pieces, like the external and the internal of a character, because each really informs the other, in terms of um,
the no, like the turning point for me in trying to like make that character was I was doing him and I was speaking, and I was like doing these performances, and it didn't have the bite I wanted for some
Uh,
reason.
uh-huh.
And I don't know. And then I was like, okay, well, what is he feeling when he's saying these things?
Yeah.
Um, and it ended up landing, at least for me, when like I added a little bit of anger, when like I felt like it was a little bit palpable that he
Yeah.
kind of hated, the average American that he was talking to in like a, truly mean way. In also thinking that he's better than them, right?
Yeah.
I was talking like condescendingly, but there wasn't like the kind of anger that comes in like true condescension. Um, and that was a weird. I didn't expect to do that because it's not. I mean, it's not what I'd imagine needing to do to come off as a politician.
Yeah.
Because they're supposed to be likable, but just a little bit of anger, I think, made it feel a little more believable. Interestingly.
That's really what a cool what a cool character exploration, man. Um, I wondered if you could just Artemisia, if you could talk a little bit about so the film project I Am that we've been working on. You and the seven other poets, Akira, Arwen, Blanca, Jesus, Yavana, Yamas, and
Oh, did you get Arwen?
Arwen, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and Teresa. You all worked with Israel Aros Lopez, workshopping poems together and creating these poems. And I know, the workshop process is a private, it's really a sacred thing. But I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about for you, what the experience was like workshopping this poem, and also just collaborating both with Israel and these other poets.
I mean, I think that workshop, those first few workshops were really wonderful to me because I'm like a young poet. Aside from like the fact that I attended art school, and so there's like a creative writing department, there is not a space where like a lot of young artists, especially young poets, at least in my lifetime, have convened. You know, I'm coming up like where Where's 21 is gone, and the South Side Teen Center is, I think, a potential, hopefully. But there isn't really a place where like I've had that convening ever happen before in my life. And the fact that it would happen like this year during quarantine, that like that community moment, that like fundamental community building moment that I think should and has to happen for our like youth art scene here, that it would happen during quarantine was like a wonderful surprise. That workshopping process was interesting. Um, yeah, I went through a lot of different poems before I landed on that one. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I wrote that one like right up to the due date.
Mm-hmm.
Um, which is like what always happens for some reason. I think I'm an adrenaline junkie or something. But um, that piece was inspired by like some truly terrible things. Um, and like the fact that I felt like I needed to use any platform I had to speak about them and to mourn. And there was one note that Israel gave me that was really useful. I say that like after I make a thing, I don't edit it. I do absolutely let other people edit it because they, I think, usually have something that I don't know how to see. And Israel told me to, because I was talking about this pain and this oppression and this violence. And Israel was like, okay, that's good, but talk about what the alternative is, describe the hope more, describe like what a better world would look like in comparison. And that's the part I always have the hardest time with. And we're talking about it, a lot of my performance starts in a place of anger. And so those like statements of imagination and hope are hard sometimes. And I haven't fully learned how to do them. That's like, I think the next place I need to go, the next thing I need to learn. Um, and someone called me on it and I actually had to do it. And I think it's not my perfect piece, but I spent a while just figuring out what a better thing would look like not just being angry about this is what it is, but this is what it could be.
Mm.
Uh, and it can hurt to be hopeful like that, but it was also really rewarding. And I also think like it helped me. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So it was a wonderful feels. So glad. Like, it was a very valuable experience.
Yeah. 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 Wow. Um, you, I, you talked at one point about said I was just an earlier interview with you before COVID, and you said that organizing is a kind of art. It's the kind of art I want to pursue. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So it's my general belief, and also warning, I may sneeze in a second.
Oh,
Just preemptive.
preemptive warning.
Yeah. I mean, I conceptualize like organizing as a kind of art form, or at the very least, I don't see there being a big gap. Like when I'm doing poetry, when I'm making visual art, when I am working like politically, whether that be lobbying or protest or everything in between. Um, the point is to use images and medium and voice and language and or rhetoric, if you want to make it simple, to use rhetoric to communicate something to an audience.
Mm.
Right? A protest is all about audience. That's what's tricky. I think, like when you do a mass protest, the point isn't really like nothing is actually achieved except for when we're talking about a labor strike. But if we're just talking about like a protest, right? Very little is actually achieved by having a group of people stand in a place together with signs, right? Like on a practical level, that doesn't do much. But we've seen historically the protests can have incredible effect because of the performance relationship that has, because of like, where are you standing? What signs are you holding up? What are you saying? And what does it mean that this many people are saying this thing together in this space, right? And those are the same like meanings by which I could understand a good poem or a powerful piece of theater. Like what are people saying? Where are they saying it? And what is the like relationship that they're having with the people who are perceiving them doing this?
Mm.
I think a good organizer is like a good speaker and a good leader, and a good healer, but also like a stage manager. Because a lot of what you get out of a protest, like you look at the civil rights movement, and some of the biggest jumps happen after these horrible pictures are taken at protests, right? Where you have like images of police officers coming to like young children protesting.
Yeah.
And you've even had images like that over the summer, right? Or even now. And images like that, where you can set up like, or not set up, it's not really staged in the same way as like a play, but when you can make, I think Martin Luther King talks about using creative tension to indicate and expose pre-existing violent tension, right? And
Mm.
so by having this protest
Yeah.
and having the police respond so violently,
Mm.
you've got this stage and you've produced this image, this spectacle that
Yeah.
makes so very clear the imbalanced power dynamic between group A and group B, right? Between the police and the people they're pretending to serve, as an example. And so it's my belief that like the reasons that I do art, which are reasons of communication, and like the leveraging of spectacle in order to mobilize an audience, are the same reasons that I do political organizing.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing art get more and more political. Like so many artists I know are becoming more and more activists.
Mm.
And activists, I think, like myself, are realizing that we need new tools in order to fight for resistance because we have a limited time span. And as much as like our old tools have worked in the past, they also haven't worked because we're still here doing this fight. And so we need to innovate. And I think that direction comes in, in the path, like in the tradition of Martin Luther King's creative tension.
Yeah. 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 That's yeah. Well, just kind of just to follow up on that, Artemisio, just wanted to kind of a final question to you. Um, I just wanted to, for you, whether it be as a visual artist, whether it be as a poet, as doing spoken word, or even with your organizing work, I wondered if you could just describe, is there a moment that you can remember or a memory that you can remember of being an artist where you felt like, oh, this is why I have to do this is why I have to be an artist. Do you know what I mean? Is there a moment that you can remember where you just like, this moment here, this is why I love it,
Hmm.
or this is why I have to do this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that like Hmm. There was a moment where I was working with actually one of my first poetry teachers a few years after I had met them, or maybe a year after I met them. And they had this little speaker series in Santa Fe. I say little, I don't mean that because I just, at that point, it's like a little small, but this speaker series that I was like helping to run in Santa Fe. I was just assisting really. Um, and we did this thing called Queer Moon. I think I'm remembering that correctly.
Mhm.
And it was a poetry reading at midnight under the full moon. Or maybe it was at like 10 o'clock or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm making it more romantic in my head. But it was at night at a park
Yeah.
under the full moon. And it was a performance of poetry. And we got a terrible turnout. Like so few people showed up.
Mhm.
It was like me and Georgia and one of my friends, and then like I think a few of Georgia's friends from the IAI. And also her brother and a few of their friends stopped by for a second. But in terms of a poetry reading, you're hoping for like to maybe break 20, right?
Yeah.
It was it was a terrible turnout. And but what that also meant is that everyone ended up performing poetry. Like I think maybe one or two people didn't, but really everyone had the opportunity, and most people did end up performing. And I ended up performing at the end. And I ended up doing this poem. It's like about the first time I fell in love with a girl. And I'd performed it in other places. I performed it when I was like a finalist for the Youth Poet Laureate a couple years before. And that is still one of my favorite performances in my life. Because like I had just been, in the dark eating popcorn with
Yeah.
like this group of like 10 people,
Yeah.
10's maybe overestimating 7 people. And we'd all heard each other speak poetry, and I was coming up last and I did it. And like, because we were all just together in the space, every single one of those bars like landed, and like the little jokes and the
Yeah.
innuendos like landed in a way that like they'd never land with a big audience, and especially not with the audiences I was like in front of typically at those times. Um, and it was so nice because it wasn't just like about me sharing my thing with a group of people to listen to my thing. And it wasn't just about me listening to someone else. It was like genuinely, we're all doing art together. And this is this shared little moment that is singular. And it was small. I had some tea, I had some popcorn. I said like one love poem. But it's one of my happiest memories in terms of performing and in terms of just being alive.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Artemizio, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been hugely inspiring. I really appreciate this time. And I want to thank all of you all for joining us. Again, we have these interviews. We send them out to our email list. So if you're seeing this and you're not on our email list and would like to join, you can send me an email at ironweedsantafe@gmail.com, and we'll add you and also let you know about future projects and performances we have going on. We'll also let you know about I Am, our short film, which is coming out and features Artemisio and 7 other wonderful poets coming out this summer. I'd also like to thank Theater Santa Fe at theatersantafe.org. They actually host all of our interviews on their website, so you can see this interview and our other 33 that we've done now at this point on the theatersantafe.org website. But again, thank you all very much for joining us this evening. Artemisio, thanks again so much.
Thank you for having me, Scott.